around impairment, disability and diversity, and the history of eugenicist thinking in this country in particular. News reports in 2017 that Down syndrome was effectively being screened out of existence in Iceland emphasised the idea that genetic research poses an existential threat to particular groups of disabled people. And it was really this that prompted me to explore the ways in which disabled lives are imagined in conversations and popular cultural discourse about prenatal diagnosis. Now, the D4D project ended in the midst of the pandemic and the grim reality that the deaths of disabled people were routinely explained away as a kind of collateral damage. The impact of COVID-19 on learning disabled people was particularly marked. People in this group were 5 times more likely to be admitted to hospital and 8 times more likely to die than their non-disabled peers. And stories of the kind of imposition of do not resuscitate orders without any consultation on young learning disabled people are really indicative of a fundamental failure to view learning disabled people as equally deserving of a right to life. Prominent bioethicists such as Julian Savulescu, who is a chair in practical ethics at the University of Oxford, really sort of actively defended discrimination in healthcare during the pandemic on the grounds of age and disability, sort of normalising and legitimising health inequalities, unequal treatment and unequal access to critical care. The fragility of disabled people's rights and the rapidity with which any semblance of equality melted into air is important for the discussion that follows. And it's why I think it's appropriate to describe the current climate as producing a particularly hostile environment for disabled people and in this context, learning disabled people in particular. And I'll say something more about my use of that phrase in a moment. The issues I want to explore here are also further complicated, I think, by the discussion that's emerged around Heidi Crowther's challenge to the element of the 1967 Abortion Act that enables late-stage termination of a pregnancy on the grounds of the detection of trisomy 21. And the fallout from this case, and including the discussion around the Down Syndrome Act that was implemented in 2022, and the kind of involvement of right-wing anti-abortion MPs such as Liam Fox brings an additional political complexities to the ways in which we talk about and work through the potential collision of disability rights and a certain strand of feminism in the context of the prenatal diagnosis of genetic conditions and the rights to terminate an unwanted pregnancy. This is something that, you know, perhaps we want to pick up on and talk about together in the discussions following the paper. Okay, so enough contextualizing there. This paper then considers the ways in which Down syndrome, trisomy 21, is imagined and materialized in contemporary culture across different domains, within the discourses and apparatus of prenatal diagnosis, within recent feminist and disability scholarship, and within popular cultural discourse. So, you know, I've looked at in my work sort of everything from, you know, the ways it's talked about sort of in journalism to the ways in which it's written about in sort of fiction. So the paper itself explores the complex entanglement of new reproductive technologies, genetics, health economics, rights-based discourses, and ethical considerations of the value of human life. As such, it considers the articulation of ableism with what Andre Gortz describes as a resolutely instrumental economic rationality, quote, dominated by the concern for efficiency, productivity, and optimum performance, end quote. Setting out to identify some of the genetic fictions that have emerged as an effect of these relationships, what I want to do is to sort of speak to debates within and without feminism and disability studies as to the implications of new genetic technologies on the lives of disabled people, and particularly the extent to which these technologies render some groups of people with genetic conditions existentially vulnerable, with the potential literally to screen them out of existence. So, mindful of the contemporary political usage of the phrase hostile environment in the United Kingdom to convey the creation of an environment in which the lives of migrants are deliberately rendered unbearably difficult, I want to use the phrase here to describe the emergence and embedding of thinking about prenatal genetic testing and Down syndrome across multiple and overlapping forms and sites of learning, in which learning disability is predominantly framed in terms of deficit, difficulty, parental disappointment, and struggle. This kind of pedagogy of suffering and parental burden taps into the realities of systemic ableism, from lack of support, poverty, poor educational opportunities, low aspiration, and unequal access to healthcare. But it does so in order to reinforce rather than challenge structural inequality, discriminatory attitudes and practices. As Gareth Thomas notes, screening for Down syndrome has become a routine element of prenatal care. And this in itself enmeshes perceptions of what it means to identify trisomy 21 with ideas of risk and the potential and pressure to take preventative action. So what Thomas is arguing there is that because this has become so routine, it automatically attaches the idea of Down syndrome with the idea of a risk that needs to be addressed or mitigated or prevented. Okay. So what I'm going to do first is to map the contours of this hostile environment, including justifications and challenges to prenatal screening programs and the implications of the adoption of particular technologies, most recently and notably that of cell-free DNA, which is cfDNA testing, commonly known as non-invasive prenatal testing, or NIPT. This technique, which is marketed globally under the brand name The Harmony, and the picture on the slide here is of an advert for the genetic test, which just has the image of a young Asian woman sort of looking into the distance with Harmony prenatal test written by the side of her face. The technique involves taking a blood sample during the first trimester of pregnancy at 9 or 10 weeks, and it works by counting the number of placental cfDNA fragments from the different chromosomes present in the blood. So it enables the measurement of the underlying genetic makeup of trisomy 21, which is Down syndrome, trisomy 18, which is Edwards syndrome, and trisomy 13, which is Patau syndrome. Now, the stated advantages of this diagnostic test is that it's firstly more accurate than the combined test, and it carries no known risk of miscarriage. However, as I'm going to discuss, this screening technique presents a significant ethical challenge from a disability rights-based perspective. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go on to consider some of the material effects of this kind of assemblage of techniques, forms of knowledge and knowing, and bodies, focusing particularly on the evocation of two very powerful genetic fictions in the fields of prenatal genetic testing and discourses of reproductive choice in contemporary feminism. So firstly, the first genetic fiction I'm interested in is the imagined, but not yet, perhaps never to be born infant with Down syndrome. And second, equally crucial in this kind of discourse, is the imagined, but not yet, perhaps never to be materialized, figure of the mother who suffers. And you know, it's mother who suffers because it is a discourse in which the mother is very prominent as a figure. or the idea of the mother. So I'm focusing here on the place and function of trisomy 21 in prenatal diagnosis. And what I'm going to argue is that by virtue of the ease with which trisomy 21 is detected, Down syndrome has come to function as the imagined difference that encodes broader cultural fears about the value and quality of disabled people's lives more generally. It thus carries the freight of a deeply entrenched ableism, despite everything that we know about the rich and varied lives that people with Down syndrome lead, and indeed everything we know about contingency and the potential for any child or any adult to develop an illness or an impairment, what Marion Hirsch describes as, and this is a quotation, a common vulnerability emerging from the condition of living in bodies and in time. So I developed this argument fully cognizant of the tensions that often emerge between a feminist pro-choice perspective, position with which I unequivocally agree, and a disability rights-based argument that the detection of trisomy 21 alone is not sufficient grounds upon which to terminate an otherwise wanted pregnancy. A position with which, as someone who spends a lot of time with young people with Down syndrome, I'm also in agreement. However, it would be disingenuous to present this as a straightforward or easy terrain to navigate in practice. And it requires an acknowledgement of the profoundly messy, complicated and contextual nature of decision-making, particularly in an ableist, economically unequal culture dominated by neo-utilitarian premises about human value. I'm really indebted to Alison Pietmeyer's very provocative critique of dominant feminist framings of prenatal testing and disability. And this sort of shapes my discussion of another feminist writer, Ilana Lowy's extensive and influential work on prenatal testing. You know, and I want to explore this problem with a particular sort of focus on the assumptions about disability that underpin her analysis of reproductive choice. This is it. So this includes the absence of the voices of disabled people in her work and in the work of a lot of feminists who've written about this kind of historically, and the ease with she dismisses the kind of epistemic privilege experienced by both learning disabled people and their families. In other words, the understanding of what it means to live with a particular difference. Speaking as the parent of a disabled child and as somebody with a genetic condition myself, feminists such as Lowy's refusal to entertain anything but the stereotype of mothers and Down syndrome as a tragedy is exhausting and deeply unhelpful, and points to the shortcomings of dominant white middle-class non-disabled iterations of feminism when it comes to addressing the intersectional realities with which we live. Okay, so part one, valuing people. Much recent scholarship in reproductive ethics and public policy has focused on the financial, economic and societal impact of disability, and therefore the economic benefits of prenatal genetic screening for readily detectable conditions such as Down syndrome. For instance, in their essay, and I've got the quotation up on the screen here, The Economic Costs of Childhood Disability, Mark Stabile and Sarah Allen set out to calculate the direct, indirect and long-term economic costs of having a disabled child in order to conclude that, quote, many expensive interventions to prevent and reduce childhood disability might well be justified by a cost-benefit calculation. This was written in 2012. Drawing on the work of prominent neoliberal thinkers such as Gary Becker and the health economist Michael Grossman, the authors embrace a model of health as a stock, a quote, input in the production of human capital, the development of the competencies and knowledge that increase one's ability to work and be productive. So like so much work in the field of health economics in the global north, there is no endeavour to situate the calculation of the financial costs associated with disability alongside any sustained ethical consideration of the value of human life in all its diversity, or even any acknowledgement of the ethical questions that circumscribe their approach. Their analysis draws upon and reinforces a deficit model of disability in which the disabled child, or the imagined disabled child, is figured only as the locus of parental suffering and strain, or financial and societal burden. Abstracted and hypothetical, this pleasure-stealing, resource-consuming, energy-sapping figure is the absent centre around which various forms of loss and detriment are traced. The uniqueness and concrete particularity of life, of a life, is placed in parenthesis for a calculation of human value, which is reduced to a stark economic logic and a very narrowly conceived notion of productivity and societal contribution. And you can see exactly this same kind of thing going on in the pronouncements of people like Julian Savulescu about who should get critical care, who deserves to have critical care in a time of pandemic. That idea that what matters really primarily about people is their productivity and ability to contribute to the economy in very narrowly circumscribed ways. So it's upon this terrain that health economists working in advanced economies have produced cost-benefit evaluations of different screening technologies. For instance, Song et al. Compare the costs of early detection of trisomy 21 and the termination of pregnancy with the costs of the first 5 years of life for a person with Down syndrome, noting that, and this is a quote, clinical benefits are realised in the setting of also achieving cost savings. This logic characterises numerous papers that assess the economic advantages in particular national healthcare contexts of entering into a commercial relationship with the laboratories that produce and market the technology. As Kibble and Vanstone have noted, quote, cost effectiveness evaluations of a non-invasive prenatal testing often assess its ability to deliver on goals, i.e. preventing the birth of children with disabilities, that social and ethical analyses suggest it should not have. And I think this is really interesting because you can see the kind of divergence between the logic of the economic models that underpin public health systems and then the kind of political discussions around disability rights, for instance, that were simultaneously taking place. And there's clearly a very big difference. Indeed, reflecting on the ethical dilemmas to which the widespread adoption of technologies such as NIPT give rise, Megan Best has noted that the routinization of prenatal genetic screening often occurs without the comprehensive counselling that accompanies other kinds of genetic testing and on the basis of assumed consent rather than true individual preference for fetal chromosomal information. She argues that, quote, medical counselling is often construed as a medical directive by the women seeking antenatal care on the basis of a, quote, innate power imbalance in the doctor-patient relationship, which puts the woman in a position where the autonomous choice to screen is in fact experienced as an inability to justify not doing so. In other words, what she's saying there is that it's very difficult to opt out of this kind of testing regime, particularly when it's presented as being in everyone's best interest. If this highlights the difficulties that attend the realisation of informed consent in prenatal screening programmes, research also indicates that the very perception and representation of non-invasive prenatal testing as easy or just another blood test also serves as a barrier to informed decision-making, because people are not necessarily aware of or prepared for the potential outcome of the test. Although there's often an assumption that the identification of a genetic condition such as Down syndrome will end in the termination of pregnancy. And we know that this happens in the majority of cases. So when we consider questions of choice and risk in this context, it's also really important to remember the commercial interests that drive the rollout of technologies such as non-invasive invasive prenatal testing, and the ways in which these contribute to the creation of a culture in which selective termination is routinized as an effect of the testing regime, and consequently negative perceptions of particular conditions. As sorry, I'm just letting people in as I go. I don't know if you can do that. As keep my own notes. Having the test isn't a neutral situation. It can create and contribute to fear. For instance, NIPT is currently marketed by private health providers as a technique to identify a number of other, often very rare genetic conditions, including those caused by unusual numbers of the sex, X and Y chromosomes, such as Turner syndrome and triple X syndrome, and those caused by small bits of DNA missing called microdeletions, such as Prader-Willi syndrome and 5p deletion syndrome. So research indicates that that NIPT is not particularly effective or accurate in identifying these other kind of rarer conditions. And the Nuffield Council on Bioethics in the UK has voiced real significant concerns about the tendency to present false positives in this context. So marketing that claims 99% accuracy thus exploits and profits upon understandings of risk and associated anxieties. This kind of commercial logic emphasizes the degree to which the concept of choice must be situated in a critical analysis of the economic drivers that underpin the biopolitical logic of the prenatal diagnosis apparatus. So what we often don't properly kind of see or illuminate when we're talking about this is the kind of the fact that these technologies are market-based, market-driven, and profit making for the people who own them. Okay, so part 2, screening for trisomy 21, Down syndrome as the paradigmatic positive result of prenatal diagnosis. So as I've outlined, the centrality of ideas of disability as a cost, in other words, an emotional, familial, financial, societal burden, to the ideological justification and implementation of screening programs, is an important reminder of the systemic ableism that has long characterized healthcare as a biopolitical apparatus, the provision of which today is often shaped by neoliberal and neo-utilitarian principles, rather than the endeavour fully to recognise the value of human diversity. Indeed, if we consider the history of prenatal genetic screening and diagnosis in more detail, it's evident that the articulation of our utilitarianism and ableism is deeply imbricated in the development of this area of genomic medicine. I mean, in fact, in lots of ways, kind of eugenicist thought is bound up with the whole history of reproductive technologies, full stop. And if you've ever read work by Margaret Sanger or Margaret Stopes, who are really champions of kind of birth control, their rationale really was sort of primarily eugenic and about curtailing certain groups of women from having children and ensuring that other groups of women had sort of more control over their fertility. However, prenatal diagnosis refers to the scrutiny of the fetus coupled with the option to terminate pregnancy, and this is Ilana Lowy's formulation. And it was established as a routine element of pregnancy care in the late 1960s and early 70s. Its implementation was the product as Lowy notes, of 4 distinct developments in biomedicine. So The perfection of amniocentesis is one of them. The rise of cytogenetics, in other words, the genetic study of cells. The application of new biochemical approaches to the study of amniotic fluid and pregnant women's serum, and the development of obstetrical ultrasound, along with, and this is crucial as well, the decriminalisation of abortion in some countries. So the identification of a fetus with trisomy 21 is, as Lowy notes, the paradigmatic positive result of prenatal diagnosis and the paradigmatic justification for the termination of pregnancy. Lowy cites Susan Lindy's assertion that, quote, the selective abortion of affected fetuses was and remains the primary intervention of genomic medicine, noting that this rationale is embedded in the 20th century history of clinical genetics. So far from being sort of all about life, it's a lot about sort of the sort of termination of a life to be, and manifest this is kind of really manifest in the concerns of early genetic researchers such as Julia Bell, and Julia Bell was the scientist who identified Fragile X. So in 1959, in correspondence in the British Medical Journal, Bell focused on three main concerns for her research. She talked about A, the risks of severe handicap to the unborn child, B, the risks of acute distress and difficulty for the potential parent, perhaps for the rest of her life, i.e. again, the suffering mother, and C, the burden likely to rest upon the welfare state. So Bell's reference to the burden on the welfare state demonstrates the degree to which the history of genomic discourse is absolutely entangled with biopolitical and economic considerations that subject the value of some lives to the instrumentalist logic of a kind of cost-benefit analysis based on perceptions of societal burden. Indeed, the development of prenatal testing and the establishment of health economics as a sub-discipline of economics emerges in exactly the same period. So they are bound up together. Lowy notes that in discussing the decision to introduce screening for Down syndrome in France, a French public health expert explains that politicians could not openly admit that their aim was to reduce the number of children born with chromosomal anomalies in order to decrease the costs of care for these children. But that clearly was the rationale. There's a kind of barely concealed hostility to disability rights activists that surfaces throughout Ilana Lowy's work. And that in itself is also underpinned by a similar economic logic, noting that the decision to have a, quote, impaired child runs the risk of, quote, depleting the family's financial and emotional resources in a context of, quote, uncertainty about the fate of disabled people in economically and politically unstable times. She argues, and this is a quotation on the slide, few people object to the principle that society should provide sufficient help to disabled persons and their families, but acceptance of the generous principle is hampered by practical difficulties in fulfilling all the urgent and often competing societal needs. So we've all heard this before, and it's a kind of get to the back of the Q argument. So Lowy's position here brings together a feminist pro-choice perspective with an avowedly neo-utilitarian and deficit-led view of disability. In her work, the, quote, impaired child is associated with depletion, insecurity, and unwarranted burden. And in this respect, her response is emblematic of the kind of resignification of liberationist themes from feminism in the era of globalization and financial crisis, and of a version of feminism that happily coexists with ableism. In other words, there's a kind of a focus on a kind of individualism throughout this, which can't sort of even countenance the ways in which we might love each other, form relationships with each other, sort of coexist together in meaningful ways. So Lowy presents an argument for gender equality, which is predicated on reproductive autonomy that goes hand in hand with an ableist justification of political and ethical inequality, which then is ideologically legitimated in overtly economic terms, i.e. disabled people are a cost-related burden. In Lowy's words, prenatal diagnosis is useful as a, quote, gendered risk management technology in which the pregnant person essentially either chooses to assert themselves and their autonomy or consents to their own subjugation to the insatiable wants and needs of their disabled child. A decision which is implicitly framed as a selfish act in light of all the other urgent and competing societal needs. So she sounds a lot like Julian Savulescu, and she sounds a lot like people like Peter Singer. So this kind of emphasis and understanding of choice and autonomy underpins a number of feminist writings on reproductive rights. And as Alison Kafer puts it, makes disability do the work of defending abortion on the basis of profoundly discriminatory stereotypes about disabled people's lives and experiences of parenting disabled children. The notion of risk management in work such as Lowy's is framed by a stark economic rationality and an attendant conception of disability as parasitical dependency and familial burden. There is little consideration of messier questions and concerns and the intimate, familial, communal, and socio-economic contexts that frame decision-making and delimit the idea of choice as some unmediated expression of individual volition. As Alison Pietmeier suggests, shifting the focus from an individualized framework to one based on the principle of reproductive justice requires a response that attends to and recognizes the humanity of disabled people and the relationships between human rights and economic justice in order to create communities that make different decisions possible. Part 3. The expressivist objection. The long-standing disquiet about the implications of prenatal genetic testing for many disability scholars and activists is known as the expressivist objection. This argument claims that to eliminate a particular genetic trait through selective abortion, quote, expresses and presupposes negative, extremely damaging judgments about the value of disabled persons. In an off-cited passage from the rejected body, the feminist philosopher Susan Wendell argues that, and this is on the slide, the widespread use of selective abortion to reduce the number of people born with disabilities sends a message to children and adults with disabilities, especially people who have genetic or prenatal disabilities, that we do not want any more like you. In a similar vein, Adrienne Ash argues that prenatal testing repeats and reinforces the same tendency towards letting the part, i.e. a single trait, stand in for the whole, a kind of metonymic impulse that characterizes discriminatory attitudes towards disabled people more generally. In other words, it reproduces the tendency to reduce and flatten disabled people's lives to the contours of a specific impairment or diagnostic category, as if a particular label unlocks or explains everything about a disabled person, or all a non-disabled person might need to know. So this expressivist objection to prenatal testing has been characterized as, quote, avoiding difficult questions by scholars such as Lowy, and as theoretically incoherent by bioethicists such as John Harris. Harris, who's unapologetic in his conviction that, quote, people should practice eugenics if by that it is understood the attempt to produce healthy non-disabled children. He also argues that deliberately to make a reproductive choice knowing that the resulting child will be significantly disabled is morally problematic and often morally wrong. Likewise, Richard Dawkins has argued that there's a moral imperative to terminate a pregnancy if Down syndrome is detected, on the basis of an impressionistic and unevidenced claim that the birth of a disabled infant increases the amount of suffering in the world. Others, such as Daniel Brock, have made very similar arguments to Harris and Dawkins, but have tried to do so in response to aspects of the expressivist objection in a manner which, as Eva Kitte brilliantly demonstrates, is often opaque and rather incoherent itself. As Kitte argues, the most notable characteristics of these attempts to secure a moral requirement to select against disability, whilst wishing to avoid denigrating disabled people, is that they remain wedded to a deficit-led conception of disability as only the occasion of suffering. In other words, they unfold around a vision of disabled life as worse than no life at all, and argue that to entertain the realization of such a life is to effect harm in the creation of a world with less opportunity or diminished opportunity. As Alison Kafer notes, if disability is conceptualized as a terrible, unending tragedy, then any future that includes disability can only be a future to avoid. The value of a disability-free future is seen as self-evident. As Kafer's work emphasizes, these arguments in which screening out disability is justified as a moral imperative depend upon an entirely abstract projection, an imagined future, and therefore an essentially fictional construct of disability, cut adrift from the concrete particularities that might give it any substantive meaning. As Kitte notes, life is so strewn with contingencies that the presence or absence of a disability in an individual's life is still a predictor of what would be a better life for that person. The child who is without significant impairments may be born into a family that is not quite as loving, not quite as resourceful, not quite as accepting as a person with severe impairments. A significantly impaired child blessed with loving parents and a supportive environment and undaunted by the challenges of her impairment may flourish and have a wonderful life. The ceteris paribus clause leaves us with an empty abstraction, an idealized condition with little relevance to our non-idealized world. It cannot support the claim that a disabled life, all things considered, is a worse life than a non-disabled one. So any engagement with lived experience, or indeed any contextualized comparison of moments of pleasure, enjoyment, loss and pain in disabled and non-disabled lives, would complicate and disturb the singular condemnatory logic of this kind of ethical position in which the potential harms of an unlived life are imagined and flow from a fundamentally impoverished and ableist view of disability. It's notable that the perspectives of people with learning disabilities such as Down syndrome are rarely included in these bioethical pronouncements, although in their recent consultation about the adoption of non-invasive prenatal testing in the UK, the Nuffield Council on Bioethics managed to record the views of 6 people who identified with this label. However, it's not simply the imagined suffering of the not yet born disabled child, but also crucially the imagined suffering of the family of that child that comes into play in these debates. In her work on prenatal testing, Lowy, for instance, is absolutely scathing in her condemnation of unnamed disability activists for suggesting that there are substantial gratifications, this is her, and unexpected joys associated with raising what she describes as a special needs child. Quote, "It is difficult to achieve credibility," she says, through the telling of partial truths. As this suggests, it is difficult, if not impossible, for her to imagine that the life of someone with a child with a learning disability could be anything other than abject and unalloyed misery. And this in turn produces a constitutive suspicion of any argument to the contrary. Lowy resists any acknowledgement of the kind of epistemic privilege that being the family of a disabled person, the parent of a disabled child confers, but instead reflects this back as either overcompensation or self-deception, invalidating personal testimony on the basis that it cannot possibly be true if it does not conform to the abstracted deficit model from which her analysis proceeds. Okay, so final part. So my aim here is to highlight the function and centrality of Down syndrome to discussions about prenatal genetic testing, the intersection of economic and medical discourses, and to identify the main characters or subjects that populate these dominant discourses around screening practices, the yet to be born infant with Down syndrome and the potential yet to be materialized parent of that child. Crucially, we need to recognize that these imagined or projected subjects are distinct effects of this apparatus. They're produced by it. They are genetic fictions, so to speak, that express, as Pete Meyer notes, quote, a culture with skewed, dehumanizing views of disability, in which Down syndrome and being the parent of a child with Down syndrome are often freighted with a raft of negative attributes, casting a disabled life as intrinsically diminished and burdensome. We might describe this assemblage of practices, ideas, and pressures as producing a hostile environment, because there is so little space here afforded to disabled people's voices or the concrete particularities of lived experience in all its variability. Instead, these spectral projections function as empty placeholders, harbingers of tragedy, depletion, deficit, and struggle. These grim imagined futures, as Kafer puts it, fail to capture the diverse realities of people's lives and relationships, and often compel disabled people and their families to justify their very existence and the quality and value of their lives in order to provide a counter-narrative, a pressure to justify life itself, rarely, if ever, experienced by non-disabled people. So even the briefest of engagements with debates in health economics, bioethics, and the work of people like such as Loe, indicates that the values of autonomy, choice, recognition, and risk management are increasingly bound up with the exclusion of particular subjects, particularly those whose strong difference challenges deeply entrenched ableist norms. However, as this discussion indicates, arguments that support the principle of screening out Down syndrome as either a moral imperative or a rational choice in a time of austerity do so via the repetition and reiteration of a decontextualized and abstracted idea, a genetic fiction about what that label means, projecting meanings into lives that have not yet been lived. This is a promissory discourse which unfolds around the assumption that a life with Down syndrome is essentially a life not worth living, and it operates on a discursive level itself to screen out any recognition of the diverse, shifting, and myriad experiences that make up any life. And I'll end there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lucy, especially with everything you've got going on at the moment. I'm just stopping the recording, so I've been reminded. Let me just do this. Stop recording.